everybody. This is kind of a follow-up from the presentation I gave last month, and it's sort of a three-part series, so I don't have to sit up here for 40 minutes and just throw tons of data at you. We're kind of breaking it up. So the series, again, is called, the economy is the coast clear, or are we just a bug looking for a windshield? So last month we looked at how we got into this mess. How we got there. Tonight, what I'm going to talk about is the different schools of thought, economic schools of thought. And then next month, what we'll look at is what are we going to have? Are we headed for just an inflationary environment, hyperinflation, or deflation? And to be honest with you, the jury's still out. There are certain things that could go either way. And we'll talk about what those factors are historically, so you can kind of look at it. And the other thing we'll talk about then is what could you do with your money in each different scenario. So if you did miss last month, this is the main thing that they took away from last month. Okay, this chart basically tells the whole story, how we got into this mess. What this chart is that the total U.S. debt, meaning consumer debt, corporate debt, and government debt, compared to the size of our economy, also the gross domestic product, GDP. And what you can see is there's two big spikes. The first big spike is in 1933 at the peak of the Depression. And at that time we got we were 299% debt to GDP. So we had $3 of debt for every $1 of economic activity. Today, the chart is at about 355%. So we have $3.55 of debt for every dollar of economic activity. So that's basically it right there. And we'll touch back on this again shortly. So why am I talking about different schools of economic thought? What does that really have to do with the situation we're in? Why does anybody need to know that? Well, here's a quote from John Maynard Keynes, one of the philosophers that we'll talk about tonight. But he basically says the ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. So the things I'm going to talk about tonight are affecting various parts of our government, the Federal Reserve. So we're just going to kind of present that. So as you're out there hearing a lot of the things on the news when they're talking, you hear politicians talking, you can kind of get a feel for where they're coming from, philosophically speaking. So I already mentioned John Maynard Keynes, so we'll start off with his theory, the Keynesian School of Economics. And then we're going to talk about Milton Friedman's school, which are the monetarists. Also, sometimes you hear it called the Chicago School of Economics. And then finally, we'll finish off with the Austrian School of Economics, and that's sort of what Campaign for Liberty advocates. So when you're talking about these three different philosophies, these are kind of the main points you have to look at how they differ. The first one is dealing with debt and savings. The second one is intervention into the economy. How much are they going to tinkle with everything? And then finally, the general business cycle. Now the business cycle, as all of you know, we have periods where we grow, we hit a peak, we have a recession, we hit a trough, and we do it all again. Okay, typically when you have a business cycle, you're talking about a situation where consumers are buying goods and services. So you have factories and small businesses that are creating these goods and services, and they continue to create it, and all of a sudden you might end up having with a little bit of too much supply. So you have too much supply, so demand kind of stops. When demand kind of stops, the people who are supplying, the businesses they cut workers, and all of a sudden you have a recession. That's a typical business cycle. And eventually you work down the supply, and that demand picks up, and all of a sudden they hire more workers, and here we go again. So the business cycle is critical to understand the three different schools. Okay, so Keynesian theory. John Maynard Keynes basically developed his theories in the 1920s and 1930s, right in time for the Great Depression. And what he says is the only thing you have to really focus on is consumption. Okay, we're just looking at, we need to keep people buying stuff. That's the key. Don't worry about building up too much supply. Don't worry about debt. We just need to be buying items. So what he says is he wants to increase aggregate demand. You'll always hear people talk about aggregate demand. What's aggregate demand? It's the size of the economy. It's buying things. And what he's trying to do with his theory is basically eradicate the whole business cycle. He thinks that by doing this, you can get rid of the troughs, you can also slow down the peaks, and have consistent growth throughout. Now that sounds great, right? Total consistency, never have layoffs, anything like that. And what he wants to do is he wants to steer the economy basically with the government. He thinks the government is a tool to do this. So this is Keynesian economics in one equation. They love their equations. They have equations for everything. Everything is mathematical with Keynesians. What this is AD, which is aggregate demand, the size of the economy, equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M. And C is consumption, consumer consumption. That's all stuff we buy, the TVs, radios, autos, everything like that. I is investment. So it's all the investment. If that's a company that's building a factory, if they're putting money into new technologies, that's investment. G is obviously government spending. And then X minus M is imports minus exports. Okay, so that's basically what's coming in and going out of the country. So what he thinks is anytime C plus I slows down, which usually means we're going to have a recession, well, what has to happen is G needs to go up. So very simple, right? If C plus I goes down $1 billion, then government spending needs to go up $1 billion. Keeps things at even keel, even Steven. So, but it works the other way too. Now, a lot of times you'll hear people get on Keynesian economists or politicians promoting Keynesian theories, say, oh, they're just trying to be their government spenders. And I think a lot of people who are pro-government use his theories, but in reality, to be fair to Keynes, he also said when C plus I is growing, G should be shrinking. Okay, he talked about governments running surpluses. Imagine that. So he was always thinking that, hey, you can control it, you can get rid of the business cycle completely with government spending. And when he looks at savings and debt, he doesn't really care about either one. All he wants is to keep consumption growing. Aggregate demand must stay where it is or be growing. Okay, so that doesn't matter if you're taking debt out to buy new cars, to buy TVs, to buy a trip, to Vegas. Doesn't matter if you use savings or if you use debt. In fact, what he always talks about is when you have a recession, you have what's called a paradox of thrift. Because generally, saving money is a thrifty thing to do. But you don't want people saving money during a recession because that C plus I drops. So really what he wants is no savings, especially during recessions. So as I said, Keynes came out with this theory in the 20s and 30s, and basically it got picked up by the politicians in the 30s around the world. FDR, he had basically open access to FDR. All the programs that they set up during the Great Depression, in some way or fashion, came from Keynes. All the public works, everything like that was Keynesian. Now, if you look at it, even back then, they didn't really work. We never really got out of it. Of course, Keynesians will say, well, that was, we didn't spend enough back then. World War II, now that was a government spending. That's what got us out of the recession, or the Depression. And that really didn't do it either. But basically, in the 1960s, Keynes sort of lost his clout. And the reason was, with Keynes, he always said, if you have high inflation, it typically means you have a very robust economy of full employment. If you have high unemployment, then you can't have inflation because there's a lower demand for goods and services. Well, if you remember the 1970s, we had high unemployment and high inflation. So by the end of the 60s, people basically said, Keynes he's wrong. And all the politicians that are like that just dismissed him. But now he's making a comeback. So now there's a lot of, you've probably seen Paul Krugman, you've heard him, seen him on TV. He's a very big Keynesian economist. A lot of these folks are trying to say, look, right now we have a situation where consumers are cutting their spending, companies aren't investing in new facilities or technologies. We need government spending. We have to go back to the Keynesian way.
What was was his problem with the stimulus? Did he say it was not, like it was one-third the size it should have been?
Oh, yeah. Well, anytime you have a stimulus and it doesn't get you out of it, they say, well, it wasn't big enough. That's always a big thing.
Banker bailouts and cut Social Security, right?
Yeah, exactly. So all of those were good things. All of those things, that they keep consumers spending in some way, it's a positive. So after the Keynesian view sort of lost its prominence, then came the monetarist, or Chicago School of Economics. And a reason it kind of came into its own is back in 1979, Jimmy Carter appointed Paul Volcker to head the Federal Reserve. And Volcker believed in the monetarist view, and what he did to get rid of the inflation of the 70s, he just raised interest rates. He pulled money out of the economy to kill inflation. So the Chicago School, and it's called that because the University of Chicago is where Milton Friedman was an instructor and came up with this theory. Now, I think Milton Friedman is probably one of the best guys in the world to explain why we need capitalism and free markets. If you want something interesting, go home and Google Milton Friedman. There'll be some videos there. Nobody in the world explains it better than Milton Friedman. What he believed was every dislocation in the markets, every recession, every depression is caused by the money supply. If we have inflation, that means there's too much money in the economy. The Fed has released too much money. If we have deflation, it means there wasn't enough money. So here again, he's kind of saying we can smooth out the business cycle if we control the money supply. If things are going a little too fast, you pull the money back. Keep it even Steven. If things get too slow, pump in the juice. It'll get it going again. So the other big thing between the monetarist and Keynesian, Friedman did not like government spending. Generally, he saw the government as an inefficient party. They did spend money wisely. And the other big thing is what he saw through history is when governments were spending a lot of money, it forced the central banks to keep rates artificially low in order to keep the government so they could borrow at lower rates. And this always caused inflation. So he was always very much against government intervention through fiscal policy. Now, again, I said Friedman is very good talking about free markets and capitalism, but yet his theory really isn't completely free market oriented. Because what he believed in is that there should be a central bank, the Federal Reserve. So there should be a cartel of bankers, 12 or 13 men sitting behind closed doors who are determining our fate, our money supply. And that's not really a free market entity. But to his credit, he did think that there should be very strict calculations in when money is increased and when it's decreased. So he tried to take as much human intervention out as he could. Again, both Keynesians and monetarists were very big on formulas. Follow the formulas, everything works. His thing is, hey, if you have the formulas and you follow the formulas, and the business community and individuals can see when rates are going to go up and when rates are going to come down, and they can modify their actions accordingly. But it still isn't a pure free market theory. Now, this is really something that the Federal Reserve is following now. Ben Bernanke is a big Milton Friedman guy. And he believes that he can control what's going to happen to us with the money supply. Many of you might have heard at one time he gave a speech, I think 04, 05, where Bernanke said, hey, if we have to, we can drop money from helicopters. Just go up and just drop it off. Okay? He'll dump as much money as he has to.
But doesn't that violate the 10th Amendment that says only Congress shall coin money?
Well, it does, yeah, of course. You're expecting them to follow the Constitution, though. Okay, so then that kind of leads into the philosophy that Campaign for Liberty advocates, and that's the Austrian School of Economics. Why is it called the Austrian School? Well, the first gentlemen who started the whole theory were from Austria, so that's it. They got labeled as Austrian economics, but really, most of it now is here in the U.S., the biggest proponents of Austrian economics. It truly is the only free market system. Okay, they really believe in free markets. They don't want any kind of fiscal and monetary stimulus. They basically look at using a gold standard, because the gold standard is going to keep prices intact. The other thing it's going to do is going to control the government. The government's not going to be able to spend $14 trillion if they have to back that up with gold. They can't do it. Typically, gold throughout history has grown with the size of populations. Okay, so they've been pulling out enough gold out of the ground to basically keep pace with the growth in the human race. So it provides a stable currency. The other big difference is I talked about how Keynesians and monetarists look at formulas. You have to have formulas, you have to be able to prove everything with mathematics. Well, the Austrian school says that's a bunch of bunk. We're humans. You're not trying to determine how much force is going to come across a bridge so you can figure out how much steel needs to go into it. We have emotions, we act irrationally at times. So it's very difficult to take the human psyche and put it into an equation. What they're looking at is they want to try to keep humans out of the process as much as possible from the central planning area. They know that if you give the Federal Reserve the power, they're not going to follow the formulas. They're going to deviate when they feel they have to due to political pressure. They also know that C plus I plus G isn't going to be followed completely. So if they raise G during a recession, if they're spending more during a recession, the government's probably not going to bring it back down later. So what they want to do is leave the decisions up to you. You're the best person to make the decisions for you on an economic basis. And the economy is nothing more than all of us together. So they just believe in letting the market dictate how things work. The other big difference between the Austrian school and the other two is the business cycle. So what the Austrians look at is they say most of the really bad recessions are caused because the Federal Reserve keeps interest rates too low, too long. And what that does is two things. One, it discourages savings. When you're only getting 0.25% on your bank account, you really don't feel like you need to save because you're getting nothing for it. So what that does is it ends up getting people to go into debt. Because now they say, well, it doesn't really cost that much to buy that new plasma TV. I know I really can't afford it. I don't have the money for it. But the interest is so low, I might as well do it. And same with businesses. A lot of people might start their own business or expand the business because they say, well, capital's so cheap, I might as well borrow and try to build my business. Eventually, I'm going to make a lot of profits from it, and it's going to be way more than the interest. So what eventually that does is it creates what's called malinvestment. We're not using the capital to its best means. A lot of businesses that probably shouldn't be in business are getting capital. A lot of individuals who shouldn't be getting capital are getting it for houses and cars and everything like that.
When you say shouldn't, you mean it wouldn't be...
It wouldn't be under normal situation, under normal interest rates. Well, why is that important? Well, if you go out and you increase your debt load a lot, and let's say you buy stocks, let's say you buy bonds, let's say you buy cars, houses, whatever it is. So you have assets, but you also have the debt. Well, the problem is eventually the low interest rates are going to end. And when that does, the spigot to the debt stops. So now all of a sudden you still have assets and you still have the liabilities, but the problem is the assets start to lose value. And when you bought all these assets on debt, that debt level doesn't go down. That debt's there. You borrow from the bank wants their money back. But what happens is the assets start to lose value. And if it does it across the whole economy, so if all of us borrow too much and all of a sudden those assets start to drop, but we still have debt we have to pay, well, we're all going to start selling assets to be able to cover our debt. And what happens when everybody starts selling at the same time? Everything starts going down. Okay, you have an escalating debt crisis. What the Austrians say is what you want is a business cycle to be driven by savings and investment. Because if we had bought all these stocks and bonds and houses and companies with our own savings, well, you can kind of weather bad storms. Because you can still make your debt payments. Because these assets are based on savings and your debt level is much lower. So that's the other big thing. The other two, the monetarists and the Keynesians, they didn't worry about debt. They just wanted consumption. So again, the reason that we're in this mess is way too much debt. So now, if the Keynesian and monetarists were right, then we should be in a massive economic boom right now. Because for the monetarists, the reserves at all the banks, the Fed has basically put reserves that's gone from 1.8 billion with a B, and now it's at 1.5 trillion with a T, just since 2008. That's a lot of money that's been pumped into the banks. So if they were right by, all we have to do is put more money out there, then things will get better, then we should be better. That's a lot of money that's been put out there.
That's almost 1,000 times.
83,000% gain. So that's how much they've increased the money supply since 2008.
Plus, we've signed on to 1,500 trillion in all those credit default swaps and CDOs. And it's like we signed on to it, even though there's no money been exchanged with American taxpayers.
Yeah, the credit default swaps are completely different.
On the Glass-Steagall Act, we've just got to throw that away.
Eventually. Lowell? 2 minutes? Okay. The other reason, if the Keynesyans are right, we should be in a boom too, because the fiscal stimulus, the money the government has injected into the economy, has been unprecedented as well. $2.2 trillion more in the last 3 years than the previous 3 years ending in 2008. And what they've essentially put in is almost 30% of our gross domestic product, our GDP, which is 14 trillion, they put about a third of that in fiscal stimulus.
Isn't it higher than that? That seems low.
What, our GDP?
No, the money that the government's pumped in, I think that's low.
Well, no, what I'm saying is if you took 2005 to 2008, and in 2008 until now, they pumped in 2.2 trillion more over the last 3 years than those initial 3 years. But they put in about a third of the economy size. So almost $5 trillion they put in there. So if the Keynesyans are right, we should be in an enormous boom right now. But yet, you look at it, the stimulus that they put in it's the second biggest all-time behind World War II. So you really have to wonder if the Keynesian monetarists are right. The other thing to note is incomes are dropping. So all this money's coming in, but yet incomes for the average individual are dropping. It's very hard to see, but it breaks it down by decades. And since 1999, the average median income, adjusted for inflation, has dropped about 6% per year. So we're losing purchasing power. I'll skip this real quick. Okay. So that basically shows you the first two theories really aren't holding up. And the Austrian one, it certainly looks like it could. But of course, what that means is we have so much debt right now, it's going to take a while to whittle that down. We have $53 trillion in debt. And a healthy level would probably be about 21 trillion. So it's going to take time. And until we get to that level, we're going to have lower economic growth. But the answer is not more debt, and it's not more money being stimulated into the economy. You just have to work it off. Kind of take your medicine. So next month, what we're going to look at again, we're going to start to look at what's coming up for us. Are we going to have an inflation like the 70s? Are we going to maybe have a hyperinflation like Germany in the 20s? Or are we going to have deflation like we did in the 30s? A combination of both? What's it going to be? And then what can you look for to see what's coming, and how can you kind of protect yourself? So are there any questions?
About like what's going on now is that Standard & Poor's, Moody's, Fitch, they're all downgrading the U.S. bonds when they should be getting ready in the docks for The Hague, because they were telling us Bear Stearns, AAA, Timberwolf, Lehman Brothers, and then the next day it's -D. So they have no credibility to say that Bear Stearns was AAA and the next day it wasn't, and then they're going to downgrade the U.S. Treasury bonds and all that. And nobody says nothing about it. They should be in The Hague ready for the docks.
Yeah.
I mean,
Vicki?
That initial equation you showed us, C plus I plus G, well, that C is really minus whatever the G takes away. So those, just simple, they cancel each other out. But I actually do have a question. When we went away from the gold standard, exactly when did that start? When did it end? And why? What was the rationale for it?
Well, it was Nixon in 71, I think it was.
But wasn't it kind of gradual thing?
Well, yeah, before that, I can't, was it the 50s, they had the Bretton Woods And what they said then is that they were going to make the US dollar the world's currency. So everything, so if France was trading with Argentina for oil, they would price it in US dollars. Everything was priced in US dollars. And that's still going on today. But what happened was in 71 is Nixon said, we're going off the gold standard. And the reason was we had too much debt. So there were countries, specifically Britain and France, started bringing back in dollars, saying, okay, give us the gold, because it was backed by gold. And we didn't have enough gold to pay them. So Nixon just said, game over, we're not going to do that. We can't do that. So from that point on, we have not been on a gold standard, and neither has anybody else in the rest of the world. Now, in the 50s, when Bretton Woods first started, we were backed by the dollar, so the dollar was the world's reserve, but it was also backed by gold. So we still had a gold standard for the most part. So that's what happened.
What happened to all the gold after they went off the standard?
But, I mean, it's still out there. There's still a ton. The Fed is actually buying gold right now. So there's still gold everywhere. It's just, you can't take your dollars now. You used to be able to take your dollars and say, give me my gold for it. And you'd have exchange. Now, you can't do that.
1,600 of them.
People still have, the gold's still there. It's just you can't exchange it for your dollars. Maybe.
Need a whole lot of them.
Obama might have taken it.
Okay.
Very good.
Kirk's awesome. Don't miss next month where you're going to find out some things that you can do to protect yourself. Kirk's forgotten more things about money than I'll ever know.